Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle, and this is Afterburner. Well, 10 years have passed since that awful, beautiful Tuesday morning in September, and many people have lamented a lot of things in the time since then. But I thought it might be good to take a look at what we've achieved in the last decade, the decade between September 11th, 2001 and September 11th, 2011. Because if you take a step back and really look at it, the magnitude of the success may really surprise you. Now, within hours of the second plane flying into the World Trade Center, it became clear that the attacks had been launched by Al-Qaeda, the Islamic terror organization led by Osama bin Laden, based in Afghanistan. By the morning of the attack, Osama bin Laden had been in the process of constructing a palace for himself in Afghanistan to be used as the throne of the worldwide Islamic Caliphate that was sure to follow now that the paper tiger of America had been so soundly defeated on 9/11. What he got instead was a brilliant campaign to destroy the base of operations that he had in Afghanistan. 2 or 3 American Special Forces soldiers, often on horseback, guided by Northern Alliance Afghan allies, carried laser target designators and precision-bombed Taliban targets with so little collateral damage that the tide of public opinion rapidly turned in favor of the Americans, often helped by the judicious use of bribes to various tribal Afghan leaders. This small footprint, light touch approach, using minimal U.S. force and relying heavily on the Northern Alliance forces, meant that 3 months after the first plane hit the first tower, the Taliban regime that had sheltered bin Laden and al-Qaeda was out of power. It was a spectacular success in every way except one, because it was the local Afghan forces, some small group of what were ostensibly our allies, who spirited away Osama bin Laden from the tightening noose of U.S. forces in Tora Bora in mid-December of 2001. Bin Laden would go on to live for nearly the entire decade after he launched the attacks, but his palace in Afghanistan was never completed. And every day of his life, he lived the life of a hunted man, scurrying from safe house to safe house, living in caves, and every day growing smaller and smaller and ever more afraid. Finally dying in a pathetic, filthy little building, watching pornography and old videos of himself taken before the attacks that he thought would make him a Saladin on a throne. Now, determined to prevent future and greater attacks on America using weapons of mass destruction, the United States invaded Iraq in April of 2003, after 18 months of diplomatic maneuvering in the United Nations. Many people say this had nothing to do with the war on terror, but here are some things that we do know. First, Saddam did in fact have chemical weapons, and he did in fact have the will to use them. Ask these Kurds who were gassed to death in the town of Halabja in 1988 whether or not Saddam posed a WMD threat. But since we now know that the fear of the invasion caused Saddam to destroy his stockpiles before the invasion, WMDs were not in fact found. And you've been told that this means that the war was based on a lie, despite the fact that every intelligence agency in the world thought that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. The British, the French, the Germans, the Israelis, the Russians, all of them. The problem with waiting for a smoking gun is that it's already been fired and someone is dead. But to people who were paying attention to what the Bush administration was saying at the time, and I was paying close attention, 2 of the biggest reasons for our involvement in Iraq you might sum up as, first, the flypaper strategy, and second, the beacon strategy. And in a remarkably deep insight into the nature of our worldwide problem, you might think of them as the carrot and the stick. First, the carrot. President Bush and his advisors realized that the Islamic world was mired in despotism and dictatorship, and that this political repression was driving so much of the Islamic radicalization seen around the world. The beacon strategy gambled that a free and democratic Iraq would provide an alternative to this pathway. Concurrently, the Bush administration assumed that these Islamic radicals in al-Qaeda and elsewhere would perceive this to be a mortal threat to their global ambitions and would go all in to prevent it from happening. And they were right in both cases. Now, we lost over 4,000 American lives in Iraq, some of the very best people we've ever produced. And the mainstream media in this country announced the so-called grim milestones with relish. But what they didn't announce was the toll that we were taking on AQI, al-Qaeda in Iraq. We don't know for certain how many of the most hardcore terrorists al-Qaeda sent to Iraq were killed by U.S. forces. It's certainly in the tens of thousands, and I've heard from 50,000 up to 80,000 al-Qaeda terrorists killed in Iraq. U.S. armed forces killed those terrorists in Baghdad and Tikrit and Mosul and Fallujah, not in Disneyland or at LAX or at the Super Bowl or in the Mall of America. The operational fighting force of al-Qaeda had its back broken in Iraq. They bet the farm on that battle, and they lost. The flypaper strategy actually worked. And just this past year, we saw the so-called Arab Spring, pro-democracy uprisings in Egypt, Libya, Syria, and other dictatorships. Why? Why now? Well, they look to where the worst of the dictators once stood, Iraq, and they see people with ink-stained fingers trying to rebuild their country on the basis of freedom and human rights. It's a slow, agonizing process, but when you ask these protesters in Cairo or Damascus, why now? They will point to Iraq. Islamic extremism has been waning because Osama bin Laden knew his own people. They like the strong horse. The beacon strategy has worked too. Now, during the last decade, enhanced interrogation techniques have been applied to 2 or 3 individuals, and never to ascertain guilt or innocence. They'd freely admitted that they'd murdered nearly 3,000 Americans. They were proud of it. Waterboarding broke Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, al-Qaeda's number 3 man and the operational architect of 9/11. In the 10 years since that attack, quiet, unassuming men and women, American patriots working in dark rooms at all hours of the day and night, have used the information gotten from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and other painstaking techniques to foil no less than 11 major terror attacks since 9/11 of 2001. Plots to fly planes into downtown Los Angeles, plots to blow up a dozen airliners simultaneously all across the globe, plots to release smallpox or anthrax or plague in Western cities. You didn't hear about them because they didn't happen. And they didn't happen because some of the greatest mass murderers in history were subjected to the same procedures we perform as training on our own special forces personnel in places like Guantanamo Bay. Do you remember the days right after 9/11? I remember watching Super Bowls and Thanksgiving Day parades and packed shopping malls at Christmas and wondering when they would strike again. Well, al-Qaeda did strike again to mark the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. A bomb in Afghanistan wounded 77 American servicemen and women, and that's the best they could do. Attack American soldiers, not American civilians, and attack them on their own soil and not on ours, and not kill a single one of them. That's the best they could do, now that the flower of their once mighty terror army is buried in the sands of Iraq. It's the best they could do because we defeated them. But the real truth is that the terror reign of al-Qaeda's Second Islamic Caliphate lasted from 8:48 a.m. Eastern Time on the morning of September 11th, 2001, when Mohammed Atta's plane hit the first tower, until 10:37 a.m. that same day, when passengers of United Flight 93 forced the 4th of these guided missiles into a field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and not into the Capitol building where it was headed. It took Americans 109 minutes to figure out how to defeat these murdering savages. I remember writing a year or 2 after the event that our girls' junior varsity team got on the field and whipped their Super Bowl championship squad. Just ordinary, random American citizens conjuring through those mystic chords of memory the ingenuity, the daring, and the raw courage to prepare for and do in 30 panicky, terror-soaked minutes what the enemy's best and brightest and bravest had prepared for and rehearsed and prayed over for 3 years. You know, I wonder if in the years he had to think about it, Osama bin Laden watched his men dying at the hands of U.S. soldiers who stood in front of the same Muslim women and children that his own men hid behind, and realized that he was doomed, and that his punishment was to live long enough to watch it all fall apart. And I wonder if he had moments when it dawned on him that his reign as Caliph did indeed last precisely 109 minutes, that he was wrong about us, about who we are and what we're made of. I think he must have. Anyway, he's gone now. We're still here.